Good evening, everyone. This is Professor Hill. It's a short video for our class Introduction to Ethics Philosophy 2306 here at St. Philip's College for the summer one term of 2021. It's the 4th of July weekend. Today's Saturday, July the 3rd. And even though it's a holiday, sorry, given the nature of our short condensed class, we have an assignment that's due tomorrow night, Sunday. We've been doing the Sunday, Thursday, and I've been trying to spread things out. And but we're down to our last essay due tomorrow. And then the final exam Thursday, and that'll be it. So we're down to the wire here. And it turns out the last essay is kind of back to, the case study is back to medical ethics and to the Jenny Lake and Cassandra Callender case that we started looking at the very beginning of the term. I know it was only like, 4 weeks ago. Seems like forever. But again, that's probably just due to the condensed nature of things. And I did have a question from one of the students that I wanted to address to everybody, because it's a good point, and I wanted to make sure everybody had caught this and that I explained it, which is during the questions for this particular case study, it wants to know, in terms of the decision made by the doctors to take Cassandra out of her family, away from her mom, which they did. They went and got a court order, it's called a termination of parental rights. They get custody of her, and then they forced her to take the chemotherapy, which, as I said, back when we were doing this the first time around, would be, unconscionable to us in our medical system if it was an adult. If an adult says, I'm sick, I understand that I'm sick, and I'm rejecting treatment, then we kind of defer to the patient. The medical community, the doctors, the nurses, everybody involved, they give you options. They tell you what the consequences would be if you did this or that, but they leave the decision making up to the person or to the family if the person is not able or capable of making the decision for themselves. And that's all for adults. Now the question is, what about a minor? What about someone who's 17? And I have had students in the past say, look, I don't care if she was a minor. This is wrong. This is terrible. This is state overreach that violated her rights. And I say, well, not her legal rights, but they're like, no, more than that, like her natural rights somehow, because they either want to make the argument that she was close enough to being an adult to where she should have been able to, and to which I say, well, legally you could fight that and try to get in control, get emancipated from your parents, or in this case, be able to have the judge say that you are mature enough, capable to make your own medical decisions, which in this case, by the way, the judge said no. The judge said you are not. In part, I think, based upon the decision she had made about rejecting the chemotherapy and her reasons for it, which, as I said before, were just kind of nonsense from the internet, just garbage, and stuff which was not medically sound. Let's put it that way. So at the beginning of the questions for this particular case study, the question is the decision to remove her. Do you think it was legal or moral, and why do you think so? But then also, I want you to consider the fact that it worked, right? The doctors give her chemotherapy against her wishes, and it works, and it puts her into remission. So at least temporarily, she's free of the cancer, and is for a couple of years. But does the outcome somehow mean that it was the right decision? Or was there some rule that they followed and that made it the right decision, even if they had a different outcome? We want to wrestle with that. And then I also use this term, sources of authority. I say, look, what are your sources of authority on this? And we talked about this briefly before, and I just want to, again, I made a previous video about this. But just to remind everybody, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about a body of authority that guides us and tells us what to do and not do. And in some cases, that's really clear, like a state government or the federal government with laws, and they're very clear and they're spelled out. And if you violate them, there's consequences. Sometimes it's a little more fuzzy. A source of authority could be your family, like parents. It could be a coach. It could be a respected religious leader. It could be your own faith tradition as a coherent, discrete source of authority for you in your life. Now, again, that's one which is kind of more voluntary and it's easier to move between religions than it is like state laws or national laws, for sure, that you're born into. But that's what I mean. And I want you to think about what sources of authority are you citing? In particular, are you talking about some kind of consequentialist approach, a relativist approach, which is about values and shared, cultural values, which provide you with a framework that you're using to sort out the context? Is it a set of more objectivist type rules or principles? Some deontological approach where you're like, no, this is the rule and I'm applying it. We saw trouble with that one the first time around with this Jenny Lake case, when we talked about the rule that the parent, the mom, protects the cubs. Remember we talked about this? This is the mama bear principle, that parents sacrifice for their children. But the problem, as we saw the first time around, is who do you apply that rule to? Because if you applied it to Jenny, she stops the chemotherapy and sacrifices herself for the baby. But if you applied it to the mom, whose actual decision it really is, it's Jenny's mother, because she's a minor that's making the decision. You apply that rule to her, she says, no, you keep taking the chemotherapy, even if it ends the pregnancy, because I'm here to do whatever it takes to protect my child. That's you, Jenny. You're the minor, you're the child that needs protecting, not the person who's the decision maker. So you end up with different outcomes depending on, even with the same rule, depending on who you apply it to, Jenny or her mom. So that was a wrinkle that we wanted to work our way through in terms of applying a rule or principle-based approach in terms of what's your source of authority. And then the last thing, you'll also note that in the directions, when you get past answer these questions and you get down to the rubric, the guidelines, the last one, the fourth one, says, hey, don't forget to incorporate IHL materials into this contribution. Now, one of the students wrote me and said, hey, this IHL doesn't even apply to this case. IHL applies to armed conflict, and this is a medical ethics case. And I said, yeah, that's true. But the reason that that's there is because we're at the end of the semester. This is our last essay. And in a sense, I want you to kind of draw on everything you've learned over, from a cumulative sense, everything that you've looked at, all the chapters of the book, and the IHL. Because as you recall, one of the things we did about the IHL was I did this video on objectivism and relativism and talked about the bombing of Rotterdam, and then London, and then Tokyo, and this switch from military targets to civilian targets, from what had traditionally been considered legal targets, meaning combatants, to civilians, and the justification for that at the time. Now, it's against IHL today. You can't bomb whole cities. You can't kill civilians. That's a violation of IHL. But the question is, why? Is it just because we took a vote and agreed to it? Is there a rule or a principle that somehow exists and then we're just going to reflect that in the laws, the IHL laws that we're writing now? And let me just tell you a brief, quick story to kind of make my point about IHL and how it gets dragged into the medical ethics case, which is that most folks have taken a history class, a politics class, a civics class, where you learn about the founding fathers and the fact that they wrote first a Declaration of Independence, but then also a Constitution. And we went through the Articles of Confederation, but then we end up with our Constitution. And what's interesting about it is the facts are clear. There's great records about the events, about the Constitutional Convention, about how each of the states sent delegates, and they met, and they wrote, and they argued, and they spent time writing this out. And for example, with the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, they were saying, well, you know, what needs to be in a Bill of Rights? And how many should there be? What should they protect? And again, there's detailed records by each, you know, not just of the convention official records, the minutes, but also each of the delegates. They all kept extensive diaries, and they wrote back for instructions, and there's lots of evidence around what happened. So the facts aren't in dispute. They get to the end, they vote, they then sign it, they then take it back to their state legislatures to get them to sign it and approve of it and pass it. The whole process is laid out. And when you look back on that historically, there's two ways to kind of interpret what happened and to understand those facts. One is this approach, which is that, look, we have rights which were given to us by God or by our nature, but we're born with these rights. These are our inalienable rights. They're immutable. You can't take them away. And what happened, you know, in Philadelphia, when they're writing this down, is they're just trying to say, well, what are our rights? What are the rights that we have? And let's write them down and agree that we're going to give them legal force. We're going to reflect in this document the naturally occurring rights that we're born with. So this is the thinking that, you know, I have a right to free speech because I'm born with it. And in the United States, because we had a convention and wrote this down and passed it into laws, our laws reflect that right. Now, other countries don't have laws that do that. But the people there, like people in China, they're born with the right to free speech, but the government suppresses that right. That's why they don't have those rights. That's a way of understanding and interpreting the facts of what happened at the convention. And you see language to that effect in some of the documents, certainly in like the preamble and stuff. You'll see, you know, these that we're talking about, these self-evident God-given rights that we reflect and write down. That's kind of story number one. But story number two is, no, look what happened, which is we took great pains to have people elected and selected from the states that come together, and then they meet. And what they do is they argue about what should be in and what should not be. And they say, well, you know, this one should be in, and people say no. When they were voting on the Bill of Rights, some got accepted and included, others were rejected. And so, you know, the reason we have 10 is that others got voted down. And this approach is to say, look, we need to remember that we're a democracy, and what gives the convention and gives our Constitution force is it represents the will of the people. In our system, there's not a king, and the president is elected because the power, the source of authority, rests with the people. And we have a republic, and we have a representative government. These people are elected by us to go do our work, and if we don't like it, we'll vote in somebody else. And so the power, the source of authority, what gives it legitimacy is the voting at every step of the way. Both at the convention, where they agree and sign, after they've meticulously voted and heed and hawed and fought over everything that's to be included or not, Lots of compromise being made there. But then it goes back to the state legislatures again, because it has to be approved to give it force, to make it a source of authority. It's our agreement. It's we, the people, through our representatives that vote, and they express our will, and the sovereignty and the power is vested in those representatives, but it belongs to us as a group of people. That's what gives it its power as a source of authority. That's kind of two very different ways of looking at what are agreed upon set of facts. One, very much a deontological expression of rights and principles, either through our nature or just God-given. The other, a relativistic approach which reflects an agreement, a consensus building, the source of authority being the people and the democracy. That's how this works. So one's kind of a legal positivist approach, one's called a natural law approach. But those are kind of in tension there with explaining the Constitutional Convention. And they're in tension in why there are certain things that are included in IHL and not. You know, the question about why is IHL here is like, well, for example, civilians. We looked at all the bombing of the cities. We looked at, Rotterdam to London to Tokyo. Why is bombing of cities, the killing of civilians, against IHL now? Is it because we came to an agreement? We had a Geneva Convention and people sent representatives and they signed and they were representative of the governments? Or is it just that, no, there's a rule and we need to reflect in the law this rule? There's challenges to both perspectives. But we're trying to develop a sense of legitimacy, a sense of authority that can then be used to exert influence and control events and hopefully prevent atrocities, or at least bring people to justice afterwards if they are committed. So the point is that IHL is a manifestation of sources of authority, but the issues that are involved transcend it. Is it consequentialist or non-consequentialist? Is it objectivist or relativist? Those conversations, those questions apply to IHL, and they apply to the rest of the philosophy and the ethics and the sources of authority that we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks throughout the whole textbook. So again, the short answer, that was the long answer. The short answer is, it's not so much IHL per se, the thing itself that applies, because we're not talking about a combat situation. We're not talking about armed conflict. But there are philosophical questions that underpin that also are at play in this case study involving Cassandra Callender and, by extension, Jenny Lake. So, anyway, there's a lot at play here. And again, I mentioned a lot of this. I know some people have already turned in their essays for tomorrow. Other people are still working on them. And of course, there's still an essay for the final exam next week. And so I want you to kind of bring all of this to bear in your answers in the essays for tomorrow and the essay for the final exam. If you do have questions, let me know, as always. And I'll try to give you a more detailed personal response if you do have particular and specific questions about the case study or anything else involving the class. All right, well, like I said, it's the 4th of July. I hope you're at least getting to spend some time with your family and friends and enjoy a little bit of it. I know many of you are working all weekend anyway, but hang in there. At least this class and this work is going to come to an end pretty soon. We've only got 5 days, folks, so we're getting down to it now. All right, take care. Talk to you soon. Bye.